All right, get ready, because today we're going deep, like seriously deep. We're going to be looking at some pretty wild connections between biblical prophecy, the history of Israel, and the modern state of Israel.
Sounds intense.
It is. And you sent me that YouTube video, the one by Eliezer Lopez.
Oh, yeah, the one about Ezekiel.
Yeah, chapters 36 through 39. He's got this really fascinating take on it all, looking at prophecies through this thing he calls like a cyclical fulfillment lens. Like imagine a spiral, right? And it keeps expanding, but through time. What'd you think of all that? Anything jump out at you?
Well, the thing about Lopez is he doesn't just analyze those prophecies like they're just kind of floating there by themselves.
Yeah.
He connects them like to these big historical patterns, almost as if history's rhyming,
Yeah.
echoing across different time periods.
Ooh, I like that. History's rhyming. Okay, so where does he start with this whole cyclical fulfillment thing? What's an example?
Well, right off the bat, he points out that Ezekiel, he prophesied about the mountains of Israel becoming desolate, with enemies taking over the land, claiming it's theirs. And he links that directly to the historical expulsion of the Jews by the Romans, the renaming of Judea to Palestine.
Ah, I see.
And that whole long-held belief some people have, that the land belongs to others.
That's a really powerful connection, especially when you think about how these ideas of like ownership and belonging are still so central to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict today. It's like this ancient prophecy is still playing out in the news.
Totally. And I think even though we're not going to take sides on this complex issue, it's super important to recognize how deeply rooted these claims are. I mean, they go way back in history, and they're still shaping the political landscape.
Couldn't agree more. And you mentioned Lopez seeing this cyclical pattern in other ways too, right? He uses that word shatter to describe it. What does he mean by that?
He uses the Babylonian exile, the 70-year one, as like a shadow of the much longer exile of Jews from their land, like a preview, a smaller scale version of what was to come.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. I've always been kind of fascinated by the idea of cyclical patterns in history, like how certain themes or events keep popping up, but like on a grander scale each time. Do you think this cyclical pattern holds up in other historical periods, even like in literature?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you see echoes of these patterns all over history and in different cultures. Yeah. Think about it. Ancient Greek mythology is packed with stories about cycles of creation and destruction.
Yeah, right.
Hinduism has that concept of yugas, those vast cycles of time that keep repeating. And even in modern literature, we see these recurring themes, these motifs that suggest history isn't just a straight line, but more like a spiral.
That's a great point. And I think it really shows why this cyclical fulfillment idea is so powerful. It speaks to that like human need to find patterns and make sense of history's chaos. It makes you wonder if there's some kind of grand design, like a rhythm to the universe that we're only just starting to grasp.
Yeah, definitely worth thinking about. And, speaking of patterns, Lopez points to how Ezekiel's prophecy about the Jewish people returning to Israel actually came true after 2,000 years.
It's true. It is remarkable when you think about it.
He connects this return to the land becoming fruitful again. He contrasts how travelers back then, like Mark Twain in the 1860s, described it as barren and desolate.
Right.
Compared to how thriving and alive Israel is today with all its agriculture.
I've actually been to Israel, and it's amazing to see. The land is so vibrant, so alive. It really is a stark contrast to those old descriptions.
And to really hit that home, Lopez tells this amazing story. Imagine you're a modern-day Israeli winemaker returning to your ancestral land, and you literally stumble upon remnants of your ancestors' winemaking ancient wine vats, perfectly preserved underground.
Whoa, what a find.
Talk about a tangible connection to the past. It perfectly captures this idea of the Jewish people coming home, bringing the land back to life.
It gives me chills just thinking about it. But Lopez doesn't just stop there, right? He goes into the spiritual side of this return, too.
Oh, absolutely. He moves on to Ezekiel 36.2428, where God promises to cleanse Israel, give them a new heart and spirit, and actually live among them.
Okay.
And this is where it gets even more interesting. Lopez separates those ideas, you see. Individual spiritual renewal, which he thinks happens through accepting Jesus, and a future national transformation of all Jewish people.
So he's saying there are two levels of restoration, one for individuals and one for the whole nation of Israel.
Exactly. And that raises some big questions about how different faiths interpret this prophecy and what it could mean for the future, not just for Israel, but for the world. Do you see any potential issues there? I mean, with those two levels of restoration, especially given how diverse modern Israel is, religiously and culturally?
That's a really good question, and honestly one we should dig into more. But before we get too lost in the theological weeds, let's switch gears for a sec. Let's talk about Ezekiel 37, the vision of the valley of dry bones coming back to life. It's such a vivid, powerful image. How does Lopez connect that to Israel's restoration?
Well, Lopez sees that powerful vision as a step-by-step picture of Israel's national restoration. He says the first step is those dry bones coming together. He sees that as a representation of Jews from all over the world coming back to their ancestral homeland.
Right, which has already happened in such a remarkable way.
Exactly. But there's more to the vision than just the bones coming together.
Oh yeah, there's definitely more to it than that.
The next stage is the new spirit. Lopez argues that this is a national spiritual transformation that hasn't happened yet. And he links that to Romans 11, where Paul says, all Israel will be saved.
Okay, now we're getting into some deep theological waters here. What exactly does Paul mean by all Israel will be saved? And how does that connect to Ezekiel's vision?
Romans 11, that's one of those passages that always sparks debate.
Yeah.
You know, especially when it comes to the whole Christianity and Judaism thing. To get it, it helps to remember who Paul was, right? Jewish, followed Jesus, but struggled with why most of his own people didn't accept Jesus as the Messiah.
So how does Paul address that in Romans 11? What does he say that connects back to, Ezekiel and those dry bones?
Well, in Romans 11.2526, Paul writes, I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. And so all Israel will be saved. And it's that last bit, all Israel will be saved, that's caused so much discussion and debate.
All Israel will be saved. That's a big statement. But what does it mean? Like, does it mean literally every single Jewish person throughout history just automatically gets saved? Or is there something more to it? A more nuanced understanding of what Paul's getting at?
That's the million-dollar question. That's where the interpretations kind of split off. You've got some Christian traditions that take it very literally, believing it refers to a future mass conversion of Jewish people to Christianity before the end times. Then you have others who see it more spiritually, like all who truly believe in Jesus, whether Jew or Gentile, become part of the true Israel of God. It's more about shared values than just ethnicity,
So are there any interpretations that don't require Jewish people to convert to Christianity to be saved? What are the Jewish perspectives on this passage?
For sure. Got to acknowledge the Jewish side of things. Some Jewish theologians and scholars look at Romans 11 through the lens of Jewish belief and practice, right? They argue that all Israel will be saved could point to a time when God's plan for them is fully realized, even if that doesn't mean accepting Jesus as the Messiah the way Christians do.
That makes a lot of sense. It really shows how important it is to consider different perspectives and have those respectful conversations, especially when we're dealing with these complex theological topics. But let's bring it back to Lopez. How does he fit Romans 11 into his interpretation of Ezekiel 37 and the dry bones?
He sees the Jewish people gathering back in Israel as that first stage, the dry bones coming together. But the giving of the new spirit, that national spiritual transformation, he thinks that lines up with this all Israel will be saved moment that Paul's talking about in Romans 11.
So for Lopez, this national transformation is still in the future.
Right, and he believes it'll be huge, a pivotal point in history, like the culmination of God's plan for Israel. It could even change the world, usher in a whole new era. It really gets you thinking, especially since we're alive, to see so many ancient prophecies about Israel seemingly unfolding around us.
No doubt, it makes you wonder what it all means, what we're witnessing in our lifetime. But if we're talking about these prophecies maybe coming true now, it raises the stakes, right? What else does Lopez say about what's in store for Israel, according to Ezekiel?
Well, he doesn't just stop at Ezekiel 37. He goes on to chapters 38 and 39, which describe a future war against Israel. And this is where his analysis gets really relevant to today's world. Like, he points out the similarities to current alliances and tensions, especially in the Middle East. He's suggesting we might be living in the shadow of this prophesied conflict.
Whoa, wait. A war against Israel, like a whole coalition of nations. That's pretty intense, especially with everything going on in the world right now. Can you tell me more about what Ezekiel actually says about this war?
Okay, so Ezekiel names this nation Gog, from the land of Magog, as the leader. He describes Gog as this powerful ruler from the farthest north. Gog puts together this massive army to attack Israel. Now, pinning down exactly who or what Gog and Magog represent in today's world, that's a whole other conversation, lots of debate there. Some scholars try to match them up with specific countries, but others see them more as symbols, representing those forces against God and his people.
Sounds like a biblical mystery for sure. But before we go too far down that road, let's stick with what Ezekiel actually tells us. What does he say about Gog's motives? Why attack Israel?
According to Ezekiel, Gog is driven by greed, plain and simple. He looks at Israel, sees prosperity, sees vulnerability, figures it's right for the taking. There's even a verse, Ezekiel 38:12, that gets into Gog's head a little. It says, "You will advance against a land of unwalled villages. You will come against a peaceful and unsuspecting people, all of them living without walls and without gates and bars."
So Gog basically underestimates Israel, thinks it'll be an easy win, not factoring in any divine intervention.
It seems that way. And that's where the prophecy takes this crazy turn. Gog's got the military might, even has some initial success, but then God steps in. Supernaturally, Ezekiel describes earthquakes, fire, pestilence, wiping out Gog's army. And in the final showdown, Gog and his buddies, they're defeated, destroyed on the mountains of Israel.
Wow, what a turnaround. It's a pretty strong picture of divine judgment. But what's the message for us today? Is Ezekiel just describing something that happened way back when? Or is there a deeper meaning, something timeless we should be paying attention to?
That's a question that's echoed through history. You've got folks who take Ezekiel's prophecy literally. They believe this future war against Israel, led by someone like Gog, is not only going to happen, it's maybe about to. They see it as an end-time sign, a prelude to the second coming of Christ.
So they're looking for hints in what's happening today, trying to connect those dots between the prophecy and current events.
Exactly. And it's easy to see why, especially with all the tension and conflicts in the Middle East, right? But then you've got others who interpret it more symbolically. To them, it's a timeless warning about pride, greed, abusing power.
So in that view, Gog isn't a specific country or leader, but any force, anyone who tries to take advantage of others for their own gain.
You got it. And the message is, in the end, God defends the vulnerable and judges those who create injustice. It's a message that goes beyond any one point in history, speaks to a core moral truth that's true across cultures all throughout time.
It makes you think about the choices we make as individuals and as nations. They have consequences. But this whole thing about a war against Israel, orchestrated by someone like Gog, it really makes you wonder, do you think it's possible that this prophecy could actually happen in our lifetime? Or is it more of a symbolic representation of the struggle between good and evil, that constant battle?
That's a question we all got to wrestle with. No easy answer there. But I think the bigger point is this. Ezekiel's prophecies, whether you take them literally or symbolically, they push us to think critically about what's happening in the world today. They force us to look at greed, ambition, and conflict head on, to see how much they drive human behavior.
And remind us that history repeats itself. Those same patterns of violence and injustice from Ezekiel's time are still alive and well today. We see it every day.
We do. And that might be the most important takeaway from all of this. We're not just watching history go by. We have the power to choose, to break those cycles of violence, to work for a future where everyone, no matter their background or beliefs, can live in peace and safety.
That's a powerful message of hope, and brings us to something else Lopez explores. What happens after this war against Gog and what it means for the future of Israel and the world. And that's where things get really interesting.
What's fascinating is how Lopez ties Ezekiel's prophecies to this idea of a future messianic kingdom, a time of peace and prosperity for Israel and everyone else. He pulls in imagery from other prophetic books like Isaiah to paint this picture of a transformed world where justice, righteousness, peace, they're all in charge. Imagine no war, no poverty, no injustice.
Sounds incredible. A world completely changed by peace and justice. It's hard to wrap your head around that, you know? But what does Ezekiel say about this messianic kingdom specifically? And how does it relate to the war against Gog and the giving of the new spirit? We need some context here.
So in the chapters after the description of Gog's defeat, Ezekiel's focus shifts to the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. It's a symbol of God's presence and blessing. He gives detailed instructions about the layout of the temple, the rituals, what the priesthood will be like.
So the temple is like a key part of this vision of the messianic kingdom. Why is the temple so important in Ezekiel's prophecy?
For Ezekiel, the temple is more than just a building, right? It represents the restoration of God's covenant with Israel, a fresh start after all those years of exile and disobedience, and it signifies a spiritual change that'll happen alongside the rebuilding. He imagines a time when God will pour out his spirit on all people, cleansing them from sin, giving them the power to live the way God intended.
That sounds similar to the new spirit idea we talked about earlier. Would you say this is a fulfillment of that prophecy?
Definitely connected. Lopez sees the rebuilding of the temple and this outpouring of God's spirit as intertwined woven together as part of this messianic kingdom, a time when things are made whole again, reconciliation and spiritual renewal for both Israel and everyone else.
Okay, starting to see the bigger picture here, Ezekiel's prophecies, when you look at them together, they create this huge story of restoration, judgment, and ultimately this divine kingdom on earth. It's a story that's still captivating and challenging us, even thousands of years later.
Totally. But there's one question that comes up a lot when we get into prophecy like this. How do we know if it's meant to be taken literally or symbolically? Is there a way to unlock the true meaning?
Oh man, that's a good question. That's something I've wondered about a lot. It seems like there are so many different interpretations out there. It's hard to know which one is right, you know?
That's because there's no single answer, really. Different interpretations exist, and they all have their strengths and weaknesses. Some people look at prophecy in a very literal way, like every single word has to happen exactly as it's written. Others lean toward a more symbolic interpretation, seeing prophetic language as pointing to deeper spiritual truths instead of specific historical events.
So there's no right way to understand prophecy?
Not necessarily. I think the key is to look at the context, like when was the prophecy given? What kind of literary style is being used? And what's the overall message the prophet is trying to convey? We should also look at how different faiths have interpreted these prophecies over time. We can learn a lot from those who came before us.
So instead of getting stuck trying to predict exact events or timelines, it's more about understanding the heart of the prophecy, its message and principles. What would you say are the core messages in Ezekiel's prophecies?
For Ezekiel, I think some of the biggest messages are the faithfulness of God, what happens when we sin and disobey, the hope of restoration and renewal, and ultimately good winning over evil.
Those are themes that resonate with everyone, no matter their background. They speak to our deepest desires for justice, peace, and a world where love and compassion win out.
And that's what makes Ezekiel's prophecies so powerful, even thousands of years later. They give us a glimpse of what could be a future filled with hope, even as they challenge us to look at the reality of our world and work for something better.
So we've covered a lot in Ezekiel chapters 36 through 39. Israel's restoration, the new spirit, the war against GOG, the messianic kingdom. It's been a whirlwind tour of ancient prophecy. But Lopez keeps going, right? There's another layer, one that takes us into some seriously apocalyptic territory.
Right. Lopez doesn't shy away from one of the toughest, most misunderstood ideas in prophecy, the GOG and Magog war, and how it might be a trigger for the final battle of Armageddon. Now, that's where things get really interesting.
Well, Armageddon, now we're talking end of the world stuff. But isn't Armageddon in Revelation, not Ezekiel? How does Lopez connect those two things?
That's where his whole take on cyclical fulfillment shines, you know? He sees that GOG and Magog war in Ezekiel as a foreshadowing of the final battle of Armageddon in Revelation. Like, it's the ultimate showdown between good and evil that ushers in a new era.
So he's saying the war against GOG, the one we already talked about, is like a mini Armageddon, a smaller version of the final conflict.
That's it. And he points to the similar language and imagery used in both Ezekiel and Revelation to back this up. They both describe huge armies from all over, God stepping in supernaturally, and good winning the day.
Okay, I'm starting to see how they might be connected. But what is Armageddon, really? How does it fit into what Ezekiel's talking about? And what about that messianic kingdom we were just discussing? Help me out here.
All right, so the word Armageddon comes from the Greek way of saying Har Megiddo, which means Mount Megiddo. It's a real place in Israel, in the Jezreel Valley. It's been a strategic crossroads, seen countless battles throughout history.
So a place with a history of conflict and bloodshed, then? No wonder it's linked to the end of the world.
Exactly. And in the book of Revelation, John uses Armageddon as the symbolic spot for the final battle. God's forces, led by Jesus Christ, versus the forces of evil, led by the Antichrist and the false prophet.
So maybe not a literal battle on a specific mountain, but a symbol of the ultimate clash between good and evil, right? This cosmic showdown to decide the fate of humanity.
That's how a lot of scholars and theologians see it. They view it as a cosmic battle, a spiritual war that the whole world will be a part of. It's not just about armies and weapons, it's about hearts and minds, a struggle for the very soul of humanity.
Wow. Okay, that's pretty intense. But how does this tie back to Ezekiel and the GOG and Magog war? Why does Lopez see them as connected?
Lopez suggests that the GOG and Magog war in Ezekiel is like a sneak peek, a foreshadowing of the final battle of Armageddon. It's a smaller conflict that mirrors that ultimate clash between good and evil. It reminds us that the forces of darkness are always working, trying to mess with God's plan and destroy his people.
So even though GOG is defeated in Ezekiel, Evil doesn't go away. It just comes back in a new form in the final battle of Armageddon, like a constant back and forth between good and evil, a cosmic tug of war.
That's one way to look at it.
Yeah.
And it highlights how important it is to be aware, to realize there's this spiritual battle going on around us and to stay strong in our faith, even when things are tough and uncertain.
It's a sobering thought, especially when you look at the state of the world today. But it also highlights the hope we have in God ultimately winning. If we believe what Ezekiel says, good will win over evil in the end. God's kingdom will be established, even if it takes some serious conflict and upheaval to get there. It reminds us that even when it's darkest, there's always hope.
That's a powerful message to cling to, especially in a world that can feel so full of darkness and despair sometimes. Ezekiel's prophecies, they show us a big picture, a story of restoration, judgment, and ultimately the victory of God's love and justice.
It's a truly epic story, this cosmic drama unfolding across thousands of years. But I have to admit, I'm still a little confused about the timeline. Does Ezekiel give us any hints about when these things might happen? Or are we talking about something that could occur in our lifetime, or is this way off in the future?
That's the question everybody wants to know, right? But Ezekiel doesn't give us any specific dates or timelines. He's speaking symbolically, using imagery that can be understood in different ways, which, as we've said, is part of what makes these prophecies so fascinating and long-lasting.
So we're left to speculate and wonder, to look for clues in current events and try to decipher the hidden meanings of ancient prophecies.
To some extent, yeah. But the bigger point, I think, is that these prophecies should push us to live with a sense of urgency, with purpose, to use the time we have wisely and work towards a future that aligns with our values and beliefs.
That's a great point. It's not about obsessing over when things will happen, but about living in a way that reflects our faith and commitment to building a better world, one that shows the peace, justice, and compassion of God's kingdom.
Exactly. And that's something we can all aim for no matter what we believe or where we come from.
Okay, so we've explored Ezekiel's prophecies about Israel being restored, the new spirit, the war against Gog, the messianic kingdom, even the apocalyptic battle of Armageddon. It's been an amazing journey through ancient prophecy, considering what it might mean for us today. But Lopez doesn't stop there, does he? He takes us even deeper, exploring what happens after this final battle and what it could mean for humanity's future.
But here's where Lopez gets even deeper, you see. It's not just about the destruction in that final battle. He points to the transformative power of God's judgment. Like in Ezekiel's vision, after that war against Gog, there's this period of incredible peace and prosperity for Israel and everyone else.
So it's not all doom and gloom then. There's a positive side, a kind of new beginning, a renewal after the judgment.
That's it. Ezekiel talks about the land of Israel being healed, restored. The people, they're cleansed from sin. And God's presence, it's right there with them in a real, tangible way. He even talks about the nations recognizing the power and glory of the God of Israel, everyone coming together in unity and harmony.
It's a beautiful picture, but I gotta be honest, it's hard to wrap my head around sometimes. How do you square those apocalyptic visions with, God being loving and merciful? How can a God of love allow that much destruction and suffering?
Yeah, that's a question people have been grappling with for ages. No easy answers there. But one way to think about it is this. God's judgment, even though it's often described in these really harsh, even scary ways, might actually be an act of love and mercy, like tough love,
Tough love. How does judgment equal love? Doesn't quite compute for me.
Think of it like this. Some believe God's judgment is meant to wake us up, shake us out of our bad habits or self-destructive ways. It's a way of showing us the consequences of our choices, like, hey, this is where this path leads. And ultimately, it's about calling us back to a right relationship with Him and with each other.
So it's not about punishing just to punish, but about redemption, transformation, right?
Exactly. It's about breaking free from sin and suffering, finding a new way towards healing, becoming whole. And in Ezekiel's vision, that's what we see. The judgment on Gog and the nations leads to this time of peace and prosperity like never before, not just for Israel, but for everyone.
It's a pretty amazing vision. It makes you think, if we really believe God can bring good out of even the worst situations, how does that change how we live, how we deal with the tough stuff in the world today, the suffering, the injustice?
That's a great question. I think it pushes us to look deeper, to see that potential for change, even in the middle of suffering, to work for a future where love, justice, mercy, those things win out, even when it feels hopeless.
Definitely a call to action, right? It's like, hey, we're not just sitting back watching history happen. We're part of it, shaping the future.
Totally. We've got a part to play in making a better world, a world that reflects what God's kingdom is all about.
Yeah.
Peace, justice, compassion, reconciliation.
You know, going through these chapters of Ezekiel, it really hits you. These prophecies aren't just about predicting the future. They're about us, about humanity, the struggles we face, and the choices we make. Those choices, they determine our destiny.
Absolutely. And it's a message that speaks to everyone, no matter what you believe. That deep desire for a better world, a world without war, poverty, injustice, it's universal. And Ezekiel's prophecies, they offer a glimpse of that possibility. They show us a future where God's kingdom comes to earth.
It's a vision that gives us hope and pushes us to live with purpose, to make each choice count. Even when things are uncertain and messed up, there's always hope, always a chance for things to be made new, always the promise of a better future.
And that's where we'll leave it for today. Time to wrap up our deep dive into Ezekiel. It's been quite a journey, exploring prophecy, history, and what it means to be human.
It really has. We've explored ancient prophecies, debated how to understand them, and considered what they might mean for us today. And as always, the more we learn, the more questions pop up.
But that's what makes it so engaging, right? That search for understanding, that wrestling with the big questions. So that's what keeps us learning and growing.
Absolutely. So to everyone listening, keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, keep diving deep into whatever makes you curious, whatever lights your fire. Until next time, keep searching, keep discovering, and keep those conversations going.